Hello and welcome to HLA Live. This is the 9th episode of HLA Live, which is our weekly programme broadcast live on the HLA YouTube channel. Each week we talk to interesting people from the HLA community and beyond about the issues and topics that our community have expressed an interest in. The HLA has 6 pillars of leadership that we deliver our programmes on. The leader is a communicator, the leader is a manager, the leader is a negotiator, the leader is an innovator and entrepreneur, the leader is a follower, and the leader is a philosopher. Many of the episodes of HLA Live will cover one or more of these pillars. This week we are talking about the tick-box culture in medicine. This week's topic has been one of a series of common discussions that HLA scholars have had as part of the leader as a philosopher pillar of the HLA programme, and has always been a hotly debated subject. Pedro and Alex have put together tonight's episode of HLA Live with Eamon, Tim, Adil, Alistair and Riddy and the rest of the HLA Live team, and brought together a fabulous panel of speakers to talk about this important topic. Tonight, chairing tonight's panel will be Alex. So handing over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Johan, for the introduction, and welcome to this HLA Live episode on the tick-box culture in medicine. So my name is Alex, and I'm a junior doctor in the east of England. And unsurprisingly, I'm very interested to hear what our amazing panelists have to say as I'm chunking my way through my own e-portfolio requirements. So for many medical students and junior doctors, the tick-box culture is a familiar experience where we need to meet a series of quite arbitrary requirements to pass the year, or a certain number of sign-offs to become competent in procedures. And the aim of this session is very much to understand the series of events that have led to the current culture and discuss where we may be heading and some options for the future. So to do this, we'll have a series of talks by firstly Sir Sam Everington to describe the training up until the 2000, then Mr. Morti to discuss his experience in the noughties, and then Dr. Sarah Hallett to describe the current training system. Afterwards, we'll have a panel discussion and then take some questions via the Slack channel. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sir Sam Everington. He is the chair of Tower Hamlets CCG and clinical lead of his Sustainable and Transformation Partnership. Sam is the vice president of the BMA. He is the member of the Ministerial National NHS Property Board, NHS Resolution and East London Foundation Trust Boards, and a fellow of the Queen Mary University London and vice president of Queen's Nursing Institute. Sam, are you with us?
Okay, I'm Sam Everington. I've been a GP now for 30 years in Tower Hamlets and trained originally here as a GP. I'm going to talk a bit about what training was like many years ago. Fundamentally, we did house jobs, which was 6 months for me working in ENT at the Royal Free Hospital, and then 6 months working at King George's Hospital. When I remember well, we had our own mess. We had bedrooms. We had our own dining room, and all the food was put on the table for us, and our beds were changed. It was a very different world. It was long hours, so we did 84 hours a week on average, and that's what led me to run the Junior Doctors Hours campaign in 1989, where we campaigned to reduce, can you believe it, our hours of work to 72 hours a week. I then did 4 6 months post. One was obstetrics, working with Wendy Savage, and that was a 1 in 2 job, and that was an average of 122 hours a week. I remember that was utterly exhausting. There were some good things though, actually, and that really came home to me when my son, who's a junior doctor now, started talking to me before the junior doctors strike about what it was like for junior doctors, I kind of thought we'd solved the problem of the long hours. But the story he gave me was something very different. So what was good in those days, and what is the things that we almost need to go back to? Well, the first thing that was very good is that you were nurtured. Thank God, as a house officer, the matrons, the consultants who you worked for their firm. Okay, so you had continuity of training from them, really took you under their wing and took responsibility for what you did. So one of the things that really worried me from the Bawagawa case was actually that consultant responsibility seemed to have disappeared. Well, it wasn't like that in my day. Genuinely, they were responsible, and I was their junior, and I was well supported by the nursing and medical team and learnt a lot during that time. So that was the plus. The downside was the long hours, but you really learnt a hell of a lot and you got very well looked after. In general practice, you spent a year in those days in general practice, and there again, it was very supportive. We didn't do things like the video links. It was really in the deep end. You saw patients, you learned solidly over a year period just by seeing patient after patient. But I can remember that being a very supportive environment. And there was nothing about also being told by the system where you would go in what part of the country. You basically, you applied for any job you like. If you fell in love with somebody and decided that was your priority, you would move hospital. So there was none of the sort of controls that you have now, which personally I find quite shocking. The idea that you sit an exam, entrance exams, general practice, and you can be allocated anywhere in the country, it seems to be quite perverse from a perspective of the Royal College of GPs, which is about family medicine and families. And surely people's top priority most of the time isn't purely about a career, it's about their family, their community, where their roots are. These are things that really matter. So the flexibility we had was enormous in those days. And if you decided to go off and work abroad for 6 months, in casualties, say maybe in South Africa, that was counted. There wasn't any problem. That was truly recognised. Actually, more than recognised, it was recognised as a fantastic experience in terms of GP training. So great flexibility, great mentorship, great support. The only downside was the much longer hours. And dare I say it, the occasional GP trainer who just treated you like a free pair of hands. That didn't happen to me. The final thing I would add very quickly is we're now going back to the future, because we've just started on the 1st of August a pilot in Tower Hamlets of 4 years training in general practice straight after FY1. That means you can live in one place. That means you will be supported by a primary care team for 4 years. We're doing this on the basis of recruitment and retention. We're doing this on the basis of the fact that actually we think for many doctors, this will massively improve their life experience at this moment in time. The thought of moving every 4 to 6 months to different jobs, and as I say, what my son tells me is very little in the way of continuity of care or support, working days, then working nights. It's a very sad experience as far as I'm concerned. What I can say is the pilot in Tower Hamlets is being observed very closely, but there's a great interest from HEE about panning this out across the country. So I'll leave it there. I told you what it was like when I trained, and the irony is it looks like we're going back to many of the good things we had in those days to the pilot we're doing now in Tower Hamlets.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sam, for giving us some of that insight into what it was like. And actually, as a junior that's just started, it's almost surreal that actually existed once upon a time. Having just joined as an interim and now Foundation 1 doctor, I had very little say in where I could go. So our next speaker is Mr. Morti. He is a consultant ENT head and neck surgeon and currently the chair of the National Association of Programme Directors in ENT, an executive council member of the British Association of Endocrine and Thyroid Surgeons, and ENT UK Regional Council member. He's also previous chair of the Junior Doctors Committee and past deputy chair of the BMA Board of Science. So if you could take it away, Ram. Ram, do we have you?
Visit
Okay, bear with us a moment. So while we're getting that sorted, if we can bring on Dr. Sarah Hallett to talk about the current training system, and if I quickly introduce her. So Dr. Sarah Hallett is a paediatric junior doctor and the current chair of the BMA's UK Junior Doctors Committee. So if you could take it away, Sarah.
Hi, Alex. Thanks a lot. So we'll have to skip then from what Sam talked about then to present day, and maybe perhaps come back to that middle section shortly. So my name's Sarah. I'm the current chair of the UK Junior Doctors Committee at the BMA. And it was really interesting to hear from Sam some of his own experiences being a junior doctor, particularly reflecting on his work to try and reduce down the average number of hours per week. And he said to 72 hours, which actually is still the current maximum number of hours you should work in any 1 week or 168-hour period, maximum of 72 hours. So that work, Sam, that you undertook is still reaping benefits for junior doctors now. So I think the theme for this talk has been around thinking about tick boxes. And so I'm going to talk, there's lots of things I could talk about around our training systems as they currently are, and reflect on the kind of the pros and cons, and again, building on some of the things that Sam has said, but I'll try and think specifically about the things related to that kind of like tick box experience and that tick box concept. And, you know, I don't want to talk in too much detail about things that many of the audience, I imagine, already know or are experiencing about the current training system. But obviously, in a nutshell, medical school, foundation program, and then you go into a training program of some kind, perhaps after a bit of a break from training and a chance to catch your breath in what is now sort of dubbed a kind of F3 or F4, 5, 6 years before you enter into training. And some people take out little gaps further on as well. But once you get onto that training ladder, it's very much a conveyor belt that can kind of carries you through. There's none of kind of what Sam talked about in terms of stepping into jobs that you choose or things like that. You're very much in that training program and swept along by the system, I think. And perhaps when we get Ram back, we'll hear a little bit of what happened with MTAs and kind of the beginnings of this kind of system. And the initial kind of ambitions of bringing that system in. But anyway, so I think thinking about the tick boxes and that sort of approach to medical training, it starts in medical school. So I know many of us will have experienced the joy of kind of trekking around your hospital placements, wanting to learn, but also having that logbook in hand and having to go up to seniors and say, I just need you to sign to say I was here. And, you know, medical training, many of us love it. I certainly really enjoyed my time at the University of Nottingham. I graduated in 2013, but that felt punitive, I think. And I think it can feel like you're being a bit of a pain. And it's literally just that you can tick that box and show that you were there and prove that you have turned up, been there, you know, achieved whatever small part of the curriculum it is that you've done through that. So that starts in medical school, and then, there is no kind of end to it. So Alex was saying that he's now in the foundation program, and obviously having to work through that e-portfolio, and that continues into postgraduate training. So I'm a pediatric trainee. I have to navigate what is, I have to say, a really non-intuitive system called Kaizen. But again, it's tick boxes. It's having to do certain things every time. So that's our current system. I think, and there are some obvious negatives. I'm going to talk first about some of the potential benefits, actually, that there are to having this tick box approach. So I think some benefits are that it does give transparency. So it means that all trainees know what they are meant to achieve, whether that's in medical school, whether that's in your training program, what you are kind of supposed to have done at those different stages in your training that will then allow you to progress through and allow you to get to that next stage and to whatever your ultimate goal is, whether that is to become a GP, whether it's to become a consultant, whether it's, to become a SASC doctor. And it means that you know what you're working towards, and that you know that you're working towards objective goals. So it's not something that's kind of set by just whoever the boss is that you're working for at that time. It's something that will be working towards your eventual goal and will ensure that there is a degree of objectivity about what it is that you are working towards. I'm a big fan of the book Checklist Manifesto. I strongly recommend if you've not read it. It's in Atul Gawande, and there are some benefits to checklists in terms of it meaning that there is a process-driven approach to achieving something, essentially. And so you could argue that there is a place for that in training. My understanding as well, and perhaps Ram or Sam could kind of correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that in the past there could be quite a nepotistic approach to progression or to appointment into specialties. So there was something of an old boys club, and it was sometimes based on who you knew, and the impression you've managed to make in your kind of local area, as opposed to perhaps what you had done or achieved or the work you kind of put in. And as Sam says, that there are some benefits to being known in the system and to having that holistic sort of wraparound approach to your training. But there's also potential negatives if achieving and moving forwards in medicine is reliant on meeting kind of the very non-tangible expectations of a certain group of people. And it's all about that hidden curriculum that means that if you are from a non-typical background, if you're someone from a widening participation background, perhaps it might be more difficult if you're not already involved in that system in order to move forwards in it and to get known in that system. So there's an argument that it could create a bit more of an accessibility for all, and the same goes for recruitment as well. So I've talked about progressing through training, but also obviously recruitment is very tick box driven. There are person specifications with all these little boxes that you have to fill out, and you get given points in certain specialties when you apply for having done certain things. And again, transparency, objective measures, you could argue a lot of these things are positive in terms of avoiding that old boys club nepotistic approach. So the negatives. I think there's lots of issues with our training that we can talk about, and there's lots of work going on to try and improve some of those things. And we feed into some work through the statutory education bodies as the BMA. There's been a big bit of work recently done called Enhancing Junior Doctors' Working Lives by HLA, where there is genuine work going on to try and tackle some of these things. But nevertheless, I still think that for many people, training feels sometimes like a series of hoops. And again, that comes back to that kind of checklist. That it feels like a constant treadmill, and you're always looking to what the next thing is you have to do or achieve or tick off, and that there are these endless expectations as a junior doctor training in the UK. And that can, I think, lead to burnout sometimes, because if you're trying to balance all these expectations, and you're constantly having to think about that next step, and you can never just relax and be a doctor and learn your kind of craft, as it were, then I think that can cause that can be a contributing factor to burnout. And when you look at the surveys that have been done in the medical profession on burnout, and you see where the highest levels of burnout are, one of the highest levels is F2, and one of the highest is at the end of core training. Periods of time when, again, you've been having to jump through these hoops in order to get to the next stage each time. And I think it also invites this expectation that you should be constantly building your CV. And if you're not, then you're falling behind. And again, I'm not sure that's a particularly healthy approach, particularly for people who have reasons to want to step off the training pathway, for example. And our own research at the BMA, so when I chaired the Education and Training Committee before I became chair of the UK committee, and when I was chairing that, we undertook a survey of junior doctors, a careers survey, to look at their intentions going forwards and to try and unpick some of the reasons behind the decisions that junior doctors were making about their career progression. And one of the reasons given by many junior doctors for the reasons as to why they had decided to take an F3 year or step off the training pathway was that feeling like they were on a constant treadmill and that they were constantly having to jump through hoops and tick these check boxes. So it is something that is driving people away from continuing training. And I think that's a problem because there's lots of good reasons to take an F3, but you don't want people to feel driven to do that, to widen their experiences, to go somewhere else, to travel before coronavirus. Those are all great reasons, but you don't want people to be forced into it because of burnout, because you're failing those people if that's what's happening. I also wonder if, again, reflecting on some of what Sam said, if this tick box culture kind of drives us away from that old apprenticeship model and that model of working sort of alongside more senior members of your particular specialty and kind of like learning that craft. But I that's more of a sort of musing, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about that. So yes. The other thing that Sam said that actually made me kind of reflect again on our training is he talked about being able to step away from training and go off somewhere abroad, and that experience would very much count towards your training and be seen as a positive. And now, of course, at present, only competencies that are really gained within your training, and so within that checkbox system and within training. That counts towards that training. Otherwise, it causes problems in managing to get to your CCT, and it can't be counted towards your CCT unless it's happened in training. So I think there has been something of a recent change in this. So now, if you go down the CSER CP route to getting your specialist registration, that will now become a CCT for most specialties as opposed to being a CSER CP. So that shows some increase in flexibility because it means some of those competencies that were gained before joining that program will count towards a CCT. But there's still a way to go in terms of making sure that competencies gained outside a formal training program can actually be recognised for what they are and towards that final place that you're trying to get to, like I said, GP, consultant, SAS doctor. So those were some of my reflections around what the current system looks like. But I'm really interested to hear your questions and hopefully also from Ram if we've got him back.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was, well, again, that's pretty much the world that I know. And it's kind of quite sobering having quite that back in Sam's time, where it's very much flexibility is the key that drives the training. And whereas nowadays, yes, it is more transparent, but yes, it does feel like a conveyor belt. And throughout med school, having done sort of 5 years of it now, it is very easy to feel like you're on that conveyor belt. And looking ahead at another sort of 5 to 10 years of training, it is quite sobering. So hopefully we've got Ram back now. So I'll reintroduce him again and we can find that critical missing piece of the sandwich. So if I'd like to introduce Mr. Ram Morti, a consultant ENT head and neck surgeon, who is currently the chair of the National Association of Programme Directors in ENT, executive council member of the British Association of Endocrine and Thyroid Surgeons, and ENT UK Regional Council member. He was also past chair of the Junior Doctors Committee and past deputy chair of the BMA Board of Science. So if Ram, you could take it away.
Thank you. Apologies for my Wi-Fi connection. So I qualified in 1999 and in some ways got the tail end of the experience that Sam had, in that we were appointed to house jobs that were allocated by our medical school. So there were a limited number of choices and you could either actually opt to just be allocated a job depending on your ranking within the year, or you could apply for a certain number of jobs that were available via interview. And your PRHO year was generally a 1 in 4 on call. So you worked through the night and then the next day, and you lived in hospital accommodation. And we did 12 months of medicine, 12 months of surgery. And it was busy, it was hard, but there was a huge amount of camaraderie, and you did work as a group, and many of them have stayed friends with you throughout the rest of your career. And there was also quite a lot of social activity that went on because everybody tended to live on site. After you finished your PRHO year, you then had a number of options available to you. Many of my friends went abroad, especially to Australia or New Zealand, to do 1 or more years, and some actually settled out there. Or you could opt to go and do a standalone, what was called an SHO job, which could be anything from 6 months or longer. Or you could opt to do a rotation if you knew what your interests were, whether that was medicine, surgery, GP, etc. But they were based around the hospital. So you didn't apply to a deanery, you applied to a specific hospital or hospitals, and they normally gave you a 2-year rotation going through a job every 6 months. And there was a huge amount of flexibility in that you could pick and choose what you wanted to do. Certain of the colleges would have some criteria about the number of jobs you needed before you could apply to move on to a registrar level. But otherwise, you were allowed to kind of pick and choose specialties you did, locations you did, etc. But the problem with the SHO grade was that you could spend anything between 1 year to 6 years or more, depending on your specialty choice, where you wanted to be and how competitive it was. And there was no limitation on how long you could spend as an SHO. Once you met the minimum requirements, you could then apply for specialty training. And this was again done on a regional basis rather than nationally. So you applied for a job as it came out in a region you were interested in. And most people took the job and then accepted it. And we saw very little churn, but you would have a lot of the same people moving around, all looking for the same job. And in a similar way for the SHO, because everything was done either at a hospital level or at a regional level, there was a huge amount of variation. So it wasn't unheard of for somebody to have been turned down, as in not scored highly enough in one job in a region, and then the next day interviewed in another region and come top, with many of the same candidates still there. And that caused a degree of consternation, and people weren't really sure how it was working. And there was some degree of nepotism or who you know, and it wasn't unheard of phone calls to be made to bolster a good candidate to try and get them the job that they wanted. As an SHO as well, we didn't have any annual progression or annual meetings. You generally met with your consultant supervisor at the end of the job, and they kind of said, yes, we were happy, we thought you did fine, or you didn't do very well and you may need to rethink your career. But there wasn't any very formalized feedback that came to you, and there was very little structure as to what you were expected to have achieved within the job or how you showed that you had achieved those competencies, apart from maybe keeping your own logbook to try and demonstrate what you had done. When you then got registrar training, you did move into slightly more of a structure in that most registrar rotations had a fixed time limit that you were expected to complete your training within, and you did have an annual review called a RETA to assess your progress. But again, this generally formed the basis of clinical supervisor reports, who would all kind of write how they felt you had done and progressed through the year, and the portfolio, which contained your CV, a logbook depending on what your specialty was, collection of any audits you'd done, courses you'd attended, etc. But certainly there was no such thing as workplace-based assessments that you were expected to complete. And again, people went through, and hopefully at the end of your time, you were then signed with the CCT and you were allowed to progress in and apply for a consultant job. But with all of this slight uncertainty, what we did start to see was that people were starting to get worried about how their career went. And especially at the SHO grade, it was felt to be a bit of a lost tribe, which was what the registrars were felt to be back in the 90s. And that's why we had something called the Kalman reform to provide a bit more structure and a time limit to that. And this belief of wanting to resolve the SHO grade, to put some time limits on it, to provide some structure, essentially is then what led on to MMC, the Modernising Medical Careers, and MTAS, which was really just the application portal to do this. And where MTAS and MMC happened was that they suddenly went, we don't want people spending a long time in the SHO grade. There needs to be a bit of structure. And at the time, it was felt that run-through training, similar to an American model, where as you come out of what was then the foundation training, which was generic training, along with some exposure to specialty, that people should step straight onto that conveyor belt into becoming a specialist. And, personally, I felt that there was a slight political motivation in order to try and drive and increase the number of specialists that were out there, because people did have an opportunity to take some time between qualifying before they took up a GP or a consultant appointment. But what that meant was that there was a workforce planning that had to come in, and we needed to standardize how we appoint. And therefore that then moved towards for an SHO onto regional and national recruitment. And I think that in some ways is where this kind of tick box culture to some degrees happened, because the need was to demonstrate and show evidence of what somebody had done. And the only way you can do that is by completing assessments, etc. And in view of, whether you're a medical student or a junior doctor or a consultant, everyone's busy. And therefore, whilst the concept was fine in that it was meant to allow somebody to show how they were progressing and to demonstrate that, I think what's ended up happening is that people try and find the shortest way of doing that. And that's why we see a tick box culture. With MTAS, I think, many of you will have heard about it. Some of you may well have experienced it. But our big issue there was that the numbers just didn't match up. There were about, if I recall correctly, about 9,000 specialty training places, but over 27,000 people started applying for it. And obviously that then caused a huge amount of problems, because all of the training jobs had been rolled into MMC, and therefore none of the training jobs were then available for standalone recruitment, etc. And people quite rightly got worried, and you had groups of people, some of whom were quite advanced in their career, and some people who were just at the start of their career, all fighting and applying for the same job. And I think that poor planning is what led to the problems that we saw, and then the move since then to try and resolve it to a degree. And that's why we saw the decoupling of training and the changes to how we apply and appoint. But kind of my views, kind of going back onto our tick box culture, is that recruitment certainly has changed, and we do have a need to standardize recruitment. But I think the difficulty that we have is, how do we demonstrate that one individual is better than another individual? All of us have gone through medical school. You all have a medical degree. Everyone's registered with the GMC. Everyone's gone through a range of posts. But actually, we have no simple tool to demonstrate, whether one individual is better than another. And I think that's when we start with, in some ways, the rat race and the conveyor belt of chasing assessments, of trying to undertake projects, trying to get publications, trying to get presentations, because in some ways these are the only ways that we are able to show that difference. And this has then kind of come down into training, where there is a need to demonstrate and prove evidence of achieving the various skills that we need in the curriculum. But in order to make the process transparent that's all that can be used to demonstrate that somebody's progressing. And we are missing some of the nuances that we see of working within a team and working with individuals on a day-to-day basis, because in some ways that's what we are all going to do when we become a GP, a consultant, a SAS grade doctor, that you are going to have to demonstrate that you can work as part of a team and that you can show that consistency. And therefore it's whether we have found the right medium at the moment, or, as I feel, this is still a work in progress and the pendulum has swung towards the other extreme and we now need to start moving it back towards the middle. But I'll be really interested to hear what people's views are and the discussion that hopefully we will be moving on to now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ram, for giving us that overview to bridge the experience that Sam has and the experience that Sarah's been talking about that we currently have. So what really struck me is where you say you almost have to show the difference. So we do need a system where, or maybe we don't need a system, but currently we have a system where people are separated based on quality. And we're using a system where we have to show that difference. So my first question is really about, well, we're opening it to the panel as well. So about diversity in terms of skills development, and does tick boxing actually achieve competency? So does proof actually mean you're competent? So if 3 people say that you're an excellent team player, in reality, does that actually mean you're a team player? So I'm going to direct that to Sarah, if you're happy to pick that up. So the question being, does tick boxing actually achieve competency? Does having these, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question. I think it's particularly interesting at the moment. So I think, I was going through like the pros and cons before of what how tick boxes are kind of experienced, I think, by current junior doctors. I was trying to be quite neutral and not let my own kind of thoughts come through, but I have to say that I feel that it has gone too far. That I think that there are too many hoops for junior doctors to jump through. And I think to answer the question around do they actually achieve their aim of ensuring competency, I think there's been something really interesting that's happened over the last few months with COVID. So as a result of that, many specialties have drastically cut down on what they would normally expect their junior doctors to achieve in order to progress through their ARCP to get an outcome 1 and to go to the next stage of training. And so they have managed to, each specialty has identified kind of what they think are the critical progression points. And they've identified what are the critical things that they have to show in order to progress through those critical progression points. But at the other points where you would have had to previously perhaps had a certain number of workplace-based assessments, kind of have done kind of a audit of some kind, have the various other things that you may need to have done in order to get the outcome 1, many of the specialties have really cut that back and have allowed people to progress using and through with the outcome 1, despite the fact they haven't done those things. So I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on, that because we've been driven by a crisis to cut back on the number of tick boxes, are we saying that those junior doctors are less competent? I don't think we are. And so I hope that moving forward, one of the potentially positive outcomes from COVID-19 is that we can reflect on what we are asking junior doctors to do at each annual progression point and try and rationalise that somewhat. And because I think that identifying the critical progression points and what is needed will overall be of benefit to junior doctors.
Thank you. And Ram, do you have any thoughts on the question?
I mean, I think if the assessments are done right, I think they can be hugely helpful. And, certainly in surgical training, we see that if you're using the assessments properly to show and develop a trainee and show their progress, I think it'd be hugely helpful. But I think the problem that you fundamentally find is I think people just don't have time in their working day to do it properly. Consultants are under pressure, junior doctors are under pressure. You kind of come in, you're flat out working clinically, so's your trainer, and then you've got to try and find time to sit down and properly reflect and do something. I think, we have seen during COVID that some of the requirements have changed, but actually the CCT requirements haven't. So I think what will end up happening is people will be chasing themselves in year or 2 years' time to make sure that they still have to reach the same minimum competency levels to be awarded a CCT. And whilst I think we have given some leeway this year, I just worry that we are just building up problems in the future, especially if we don't return to the normal that everybody expects, and we have to kind of recalibrate for a new normal. But I do think that there needs to be more of a global report done by your trainers, and less, I think, of just chasing assessments for the sake of an assessment. You need 3 CBDs to get through this placement and foundation program. What have you learnt from it? Probably nothing, in that you've just done it to tick the box that you sit in an ARCP. And I think what we do need to be doing is giving people much more at the beginning to say, this is what I want you to achieve by the end of your 4 or 6 month placement in this department. And then we assess ourselves against those objectives. Has a department delivered the objectives that they said they would? And has a trainee managed to achieve the competencies to do it? And are they then confident to carry that on into the rest of their career or into the rest of their specialty? So I think that's where the work, I think, needs to be done, rather than just seeing it as a number to be achieved or a box to be ticked.
Thanks. And I'm quite interested, Sam, with the pilot study that you're doing with 4 years for GP training, I'm quite interested in where you talked about flexibility in the past, where you had the option to go for a year to another country to experience something. How do you see that sort of fitting in with the scheme that we have now? Do you think it's a possibility that we can go back to that time, or is it almost too flexible that we won't be able to meet current requirements?
Well, let me say, first of all, what Ram and Sarah described just sounds like a nightmare. It sounds like people always want to create perfection in terms of measuring people's quality, and can't accept that you're never going to do that. This has been discussed for years. Nobody's ever achieved it. What you've created is an absolute nightmare scenario for doctors. You've talked about, I've heard burnt out, tick box. This is just awful. Let me put it to you another way, not just about what the past is, but what we're doing in our pilot. Let me describe what it's like. First of all, Sarah's point about old boy, that was always the thing that was worried about. Well, actually, our 6 graduates that we've got on our screen are all international. That's certainly not old boy connections. So you can deal with that issue of not having nepotism. What happens? So they're with us for 4 years. Let me describe a bit like what it's like actually working. First of all, your team trained by people over a 4-year period. It's not even just your one trainer who's your designated trainer. Actually, it's all the other GPs, salaried partners, the nurses, the phlebotomists, the receptionists. Everyone is part of the team training, and everyone goes to a team meeting every week. Okay, there's a WhatsApp group for all the clinicians. There's a whole raft of things that are supportive. We think actually, and the reason I pushed for this pilot in the beginning was we were taking FY1s and finding with some of them that really after 4 months you could see some of them were so amazing, so enthused, that it just occurred to me, actually just have them in general practice, have to have the confidence to train. I mean, apart from anything else, if I said to an orthopedic surgeon, you're going to spend 3.5 years training in general practice and 1.5 years in orthopedics in hospital, what would they say? So why have we accepted that the opposite situation for general practice? It's a disgrace. We're entirely capable of training people and giving people a real nurturing training experience. So what would I see happening? First of all, within your first year, you will learn to actually manage a lot of the clinical problems and build confidence in that. By the end of your second year, actually, I expect you you will be doing 95% of what I do and be very confident. That leaves 2 years to do a raft of other things. You know, your masters, your MRCGP, go and get some experience doing other things. You know, there's half a day a week where you can do other things. Constantly, your mentor will be talking to you about what your gaps are. So that actually, if you're worried about dermatology, well, we ring up the dermatologist and say, can you come to the clinic? So it's personalised, it's absolutely personalised to the individual and absolutely nurturing. And you're living in one place for 4 years. What's not to love? And certainly if you've got a young family, I mean, one of my sneaky reasons for doing this, actually, particularly if people have got young families, is if I've got somebody for 4 years, by then they will have made their roots in the area. The chances of them leaving, particularly if they've got young kids who will say, sorry, dad or mum, I've got friends, I'm not leaving. You know what I mean? The chance of you leaving and therefore you not being retained in the area is very low. And so the principle, so I'm also the clinical lead for the SDP and the chair of the CCG. And the principle we're designing is grow your own. And when I say grow your own, I mean from school, from local schools, into the local medical school, into the system, training, specialty training or GP training. The idea that you nurture people and their families through the whole of their career seems to me that's far more important. And actually, at the end of the day, that's why I find it extraordinary. This, I mean, because we've just set on the pilot that you just have to achieve after the 1 year. You do have to sit the GP exam, but you just have to meet the minimum requirement. That's all. And that's what I would say about all of the training. You can't possibly measure it. You've just got to make sure that somebody is reasonably safe and certainly not burnt out and happy and has a happy family life. Those are the things that will determine. You know, I've watched GPs throughout my career get burnt out and I see exactly what it's about. It's usually about they've been, I'm trying to find the right word, disrooted, uprooted or whatever. That's part of it. They don't have flexibility. So actually, with all our GPs in Tower Hamlets, we've created massive flexibility about what they do. There's tons of opportunities to do academic stuff with the clinical effectiveness group, doing stuff on commissioning, and recognise that it's really important to give people that flexibility. By the way, the GPs that got burnt out in my day were the ones that got stuck in a partnership for life. Now that's gone. You know, actually, you can move on. You can move on to do other things. It's a much better life. But as I say, what Sarah and Ram describe is just nightmare territory. And I would suggest to you all, and hopefully we'll be able to prove it in the next 2 years, that actually what we have to offer in this pilot training is the best of all the worlds that you describe.
Yeah. So I think I really like the idea. I'm completely sold on that, I have to say. So I think what we need is to develop that flexibility within our system currently, whilst trying to maintain that transparency and clear process that we gain through the MTAs. I was just wondering, Sarah, if you had any thoughts about how we could introduce that on a wider scale. So I think it works very well in general practice, the whole sort of grow your roots idea. But for specialties where you may have to travel to different hospitals to get different types of experience or subspecialize, do you see being able to sort of, maybe as a pediatric trainee, being able to spend 8 years within a local area to develop those same kind of flexible ties?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we know, and Sam referenced this earlier, around kind of the impact of, you know, what happens if you know, God forbid, you have a family or you develop something outside of medicine that means you have to stay in one particular area. And so I think one of the things that really impacts on junior doctors is having to move those huge distances. So I think there has been some work in terms of HE trying to limit some of those geographical areas slightly so that you don't have to travel such great distances. But in reality, that is still the current situation. So I think more work to try and limit you at least within one, even if you can't be within one hospital, within one kind of like ecosystem, if that makes sense. So like one ecosystem probably isn't the right word, but kind of one maybe DPH, tertiary, you know, one small patch that you can get that experience in. I think there'd be definite benefits to it. And I do think, you know, what Sam is describing will be really interesting to see the outcomes of that pilot, because I think there are definite benefits that he's obviously outlined there that I think will suit many trainees really well.
As a thought as well. Oh, sorry, did you have something to say? So I was thinking, as a thought as well. So Sam, in your earlier career, or even Ram as well, so it sounds like there was this element of nepotistic boys club, and your work sounds like you've changed a lot of it to make the procedures very more transparent, and as a result we have points-based system. Where have we almost gone too far the opposite way, where being chosen is a bad thing and you actually need to demonstrate objective competence rather than having that ability to sort of choose the right person on a subjective scale?
So, hi, can I come back? Yep. Yeah, so I don't see. I accept that there was more nepotism in my day, and that needed dealing with. I think we're in a much better place as far as that's concerned, and I'm far less worried about it. I think the other extra point I'd make, though, is, which is Sarah's making too, is this disruption it causes to people's lives, and the obscenity for me is when you're going into general practice, you sit an exam. And if you score high, you choose where you go. If you score low, you end up being sent somewhere. And the bizarre nature of this is, if you believe that scoring high means you're a better doctor, and I'm not convinced by that, actually, because particularly in general practice, the sort of skill set we're looking for is emotional intelligence, is enthusiasm, is engagement, is working with a team, not something that's measured in those exams, to be quite honest. But if you go by their sense, they would say, therefore, the best doctors get to choose where they go to and where they're going to end up, in the nicest places. So the worst doctors end up in the most deprived places. How mad is that? And also, I think you've just got it. You see, HE, when I talk to them, they set up this system because, well, we've got to get people to go and work in these difficult places. Well, that's entirely the wrong way. That's exactly what's gone wrong with COVID, this top-down approach, this forcing people to do things. No, let me tell you a story. When I was leading the vanguards for Simon Stevens, of a lovely town in Cumbria. By the way, you go back 10 years ago, 100 applicants for every partnership post, and it was 10,000 patients, 5 partners, and they all left in one go. So the whole thing imploded. And actually, rather than actually having something assigned, the town got together, the local community got together, and they produced a whole raft of YouTube videos, including one by kids, which was lovely. It was quite beautiful. It said, come and work with us. We'll be really nice patients. We'll be really nice to you. Well, within no time, they'd recruited a whole raft of GPs. So this idea that you force people to go doesn't solve the problem. The local area has got to work out, what does it have to do? You know, 30 years ago, when I came to Tower Hamlets was a shithole. It was the last place people wanted to go to. How did we turn that around so that we get the best outcomes in diabetes and heart disease? We set up PCNs 10 years ago. We set up social prescribing practice. All this comes from Tower Hamlets. How did we do that? And the answer is we said, what is it we have to do to make this the place you want to go and work? And it was, I remember in the early days, taking people around to the private primary school that I'm still a governor of, because that was the only way to get a lot of doctors in, because the education system locally was so bad. And then I took them round to housing to see what the housing was. And we gave them academic sessions. We did a whole raft of things. And that's why the system is so badly, because you disable local systems from sorting out the problem themselves. And once they have to sort it out themselves, they'll come up with a richness of solutions, which might be, you know, in my day, they gave free accommodation to trainees. There was a whole raft of things they did.
actually raises a really interesting proposal where would we accept a position where different areas have quite different quality of training? So to actually accept that some places like Tower Hamlets, to accept that they can almost grow your own. So almost leave them to suffer with the hope that it kind of creates an environment that fosters innovation. Because it sounds like a lot of things are driven directly from Tower Hamlets, and Tower Hamlets benefits amazingly from it, but it may not necessarily work in other areas of the country. So should we actually allow that difference in approach? I don't know, because I think...
See, I don't buy that pessimistic statement at all. Do you know what I mean? If we can do it in Tower Hamlets, a really deprived area, with all the challenge we have with COVID, third greatest deaths, if we can do it there, you can do it anywhere. You really can. You've just got to say to yourself, what are the carrots and sticks we need to put in the system to encourage people to come up with their own solutions and innovate? And there's plenty of GPs around the country who are innovators. You won't have a shortage of GPs who would want to take up this pilot system. And I know Simon Gregory from the HE is really keen on spreading it across the country.
And what are those carrots and sticks?
Well, the biggest part is the carrot, to be quite honest, and it's how do you ensure that every area actually has something in place that is incentivizing and encouraging people to come there. By the way, a piece of research I published about 6 years ago with a team from Norwich showed the deciding factors in recruitment and retention was where you were born and brought up and where you trained. Okay. So once you recognize those things, once you get those things right, actually you'll get people into the area. And then you've got to break down the barriers, like the barrier you've got to break down in general practice. In my day, I took over a single-handed GP. I'm now 40,000 patients, 4 sites, okay? It was extraordinary for me to be given that opportunity as a trainee. But show me how 5 enthusiastic trainees could possibly take on an APMS contract. Impossible. That's absolutely insane, okay? Absolutely insane. And instead what we get is APMS contracts run by companies where there's no sense of ownership or belonging to a population or a community. Absolutely mad stuff. That's the stick I would apply if you want a stick, is actually stop that nonsense, okay? Give the opportunity to a group of young, newly trained GPs to start or take over a practice themselves. And that's the thing we should challenge in the system. Because actually, when you do, you see, as a GP, I would say there isn't a waking moment where I'm almost not thinking about something to do with the practice. Actually, how good's that? And it's something you grow and you create yourself. That's a fantastic opportunity. But so much of that has been taken away by the systems that we've set up.
And Sarah, did you want to pitch in on this?
Yeah, I just was going to mention something. I think that carrot approach is incredibly important. And I know that I completely understand what Sam is saying about you need to almost empower the local areas to be able to do this. But I also know that there is thinking about this at a national level, and you can say whether or not the top down or the kind of bottom up approach works. It sounds very much like the bottom up approach is working in your experience, Sam. But I think either way, I think the carrot approach is the best way to look at this. And what Sam was talking about in terms of like the inverse care law and what happens when you have kind of the best, although again, I think there is a question around what makes you the best doctor. But anyway, going to the kind of desirable areas and things like that, and how do you get around that? And I think it is around what can you do to innovate in those different training settings. And so thinking about secondary care, there are some examples of this, because there has almost been a market created through the F3 year. So when people aren't applying and aren't having to go into that training system, when they are kind of in control of their own destiny during that year out after the foundation program, what kind of things are trusts doing and creating to tempt people to come to them to fill their rota gaps? Some of the things we've seen, such as in Brighton, So in the A&E department in Brighton, they no longer have rota gaps. They don't have to use any locums because of the fact that they have managed to massively recruit. And part of that might be based on the fact that they're by the sea, and that's lovely. But also it's because of the fact that they give people flexibility. They give people control over their rotas. They use rostering software that allows people to be able to put in when they want to work, as opposed to basically being told when they have to work. And so they've come up with these ways to allow people control over their lives and over the type of work that they're doing. And therefore they've recruited. There's an example as well in Wales. In one of the A&E departments in Wales as well. And again, they've teamed it up with some flexibility and some sort of lifestyle things, and they sell the lifestyle of like the mountain medicine. And again, that brings people in. So I completely agree. It's around the carrot, and it's around how local areas can be empowered to be able to provide that for junior doctors. And I'm not sure how this fits in with tickboxing actually, but I think it's a really important discussion to have.
And I noticed the surgeons seem a little bit quiet on this front. I'm just wondering, in terms of surgery, so stereotypically, surgery has always been quite overfilled. Do you feel it necessary to have that much of a carrot approach as well?
I mean, I think you do, because, I mean, if you have a look at ENT, we've gone from a 1 in 19 competition ratio, a decade ago, to now every ST3 that met the minimum requirements got a job. So I think there has been a huge change. I think the difficulty is that what we know is that it's difficult to train within just one unit. The reason being is that you may not experience other ways of doing it. Sometimes innovation becomes slightly difficult, or learning new techniques. So I certainly feel there is some benefit where people are working in different units or different regions, because they're bringing new ideas with them, new ways of working, new ways of doing it. Because, within a region, generally you have a teaching hospital with a few of the DGHs. And if everybody's sat and learnt within the same ecosystem, I think the problem is things can get quite stagnant and people aren't seeing what happens. We do need to work out a way of how we incentivize people, whether that's looking at, I agree, our rotas have now become very inflexible, and people are giving in requests for leave, for weddings, etc., and then they're just being ignored. So I think we need to kind of value our junior doctors more. I kind of personally, from a surgical perspective, don't necessarily feel you need to be kind of getting them from school and training through medical school so that they come back as a consultant. But I certainly think as people are coming towards the end of their training, we need to be identifying and appointing people earlier, not right at the end of training, so that they can go and develop the skills that they need to allow them to do the job, rather than people are training and kind of doing fellowships and getting skills, and then hoping that it forms a right fit in the job that they want. And I think that our workforce planning, especially in the hospital sector, has been atrocious regarding that. And, I wish we can do some of what our GP colleagues have been able to do, where they've been able to innovate and develop a kind of local or regional training program that is creating the colleagues that they want in the future, and incentivizing and making them more enthusiastic to stay within an area. I think we do need to be ensuring that every area, whether it's an affluent area or a deprived area, is getting the best people to come in and work there. And we're not kind of making people just go to the less popular areas because they haven't scored as highly. And certainly that used to be there when I was an SHO, that, you would spend part of your rotation at a teaching hospital and part of your rotation at a DGH. And therefore you couldn't keep it all in the glamour of the teaching hospital, where it was all the highly specialized work was going on, and you did have to go and work and do your kind of general training in a hospital that you may not particularly want to go to, but actually generally you find that that's where you had the best time and you learned the most. I'd
just like to pick out from that as well to Sam. So we've kind of almost been talking about local pockets of innovation, and what drove you to stay in Tower Hamlets what was a developed area to have that innovation? So what kept you there? And is there a way to transfer that to other pockets of deprivation too across the country in a way to try and stimulate that innovation?
I landed in Tower Hamlets by pure accident because I got given a council flat by the GLA because I was potentially going to be a key worker. So that was almost accidental. What kept me there was people like Dr. Canvas Boomler, who might be known to some of you. He's recently retired, but he still leads the clinical effectiveness group at Queen Mary University. And they set up a project called Healthy EastEnders. And it was that and that vocation and that sense of belonging and that sense of really wanting to change things. So it was sort of semi-political in a way, not with a big P. I think that's what made the difference. And I think if you spoke to most doctors in Tower Hamlets, what they value most of all is the camaraderie. So there's things like, for example, we've divided, there are 8 PCNs and they all train together. So we have a system where each practice can close for an afternoon every month and then just to get together with its neighbouring practices and learn together. So there's simple things like that. We set up a GP out-of-hours co-op. So we still have the out-of-hours based in Tower Hamlets run by our GP family. You know, it's those sorts of things which really make all the difference. And constantly thinking about opportunities that you can give people, you know, particularly on the academic side, leadership positions. So my equalities offer to everybody as a CCG chair is if people want to be leaders, they just come to me and we'll try and get them somewhere. And actually what you see happening in the Tower Hamlets type system is everyone is a leader and it's truly bottom up. And that's now, you find that in the Mental Health Trust. ELFT, our Mental Health Trust, is considered one of the best mental health trusts in the country. Why? Bottom up. The users are involved. When you go to their annual awards ceremony, it's quite amazing, actually. You get teams up on stage and you have no idea who's the psychiatrist, who's the patient, who's the nurse. It's one big family and very much driven by users. Bottom up, absolutely critical. But the thing I think and of course that gives you autonomy, doesn't it? And autonomy is one of the most important things to stop burnout. That sense of control over your life. The more you're controlled, the less autonomy you have, and actually the more likely you are to burn out. And what I see at a 4 in the NHS, and it's why I'll be quite blunt about it, by why I really have disdain for NHS England, particularly during the COVID period, is this complete control freakery. And until you start tackling that and start designing things locally yourself, actually, you won't be free. You won't have autonomy and you will get burnt out. Oh, get rid of HEE, by the way.
Get rid of HEE.
Yeah,
Anyone has strong thoughts on that?
Yeah, and our chief exec of ELFT is going to be the chief exec there, so I'm working on her at the moment. But the idea that you centralise nationally the education programme seems to me completely bizarre. You know, 80% of our costs in the NHS is staff, okay? And yet local systems, so like our 7 CCGs, East London, North East London, has no control over any of that. That's completely perverse. So we, as CCGs, invested in setting up the Physician's Associate course at Barts, okay? By the way, against quite a lot of opposition from the general medical profession, HE wouldn't finance it at the time. Now everybody's talking about it. You know, this is mad. Local areas know what they need to invest in. HE doesn't.
Yeah. So I've been kind of toying with the idea in the head. I'm not quite sure it's completely fleshed out, but this idea that actually the FY3 year isn't a bad thing. So just to contextualize it a bit. So it kind of sounds similar to what happened in MTAs in that people didn't really go into training grades for various different reasons. Previously, it was due to a lack of training opportunities. Whereas now people are sort of hesitant in the F3 year to want to go on. In a way, this kind of creates market forces, doesn't it? You kind of reduce the demand on specialty training because people just don't want to go into it for whatever reason, whether it causes burnout. The F3 year offers pretty much unlimited flexibility. You can take F ad infinitum years in order to earn money, do whatever you like. Locum rates are also better than training rates. So almost do we actually, so my question is, on a national level, it seems like everything's very top down and people don't want that. So how do we make it bottom up? I suppose this is a question for Sarah as the current chair of the Doctors Committee. So how can we as budding juniors, or even to Sam, how can kind of leaders of your caliber and ilk, how can we all drive that bottoms up approach?
Shall I go in as you? Yeah, I think it's really interesting question, because I think it touches upon something I was talking about earlier in terms of competencies and where you gain those competencies from. So I personally think that F3 years are not a bad thing. A number of people in the system like to talk about them in terms of kind of doom, and you see people saying, oh, X number of people are not going into training. Actually, most of those people, when you look at the percentages, most do eventually go into training. Not as many as used to, but most of them do still go into training. And I think it's partly, as I've said previously, it's driven by the burnout and the just wanting to be away from those tick boxes, but it's also partly driven because people don't know what they want to do and they want to broaden themselves as physicians, and I don't think that's a bad thing, and I think that's, you know, to be encouraged. The question though is that when you gain competencies doing those kind of self-made almost training programs during times out, how do we ensure that those competencies aren't lost when you then enter into a training program? Because obviously, as soon as we start counting those competencies that are either gained in this country or indeed abroad, when people come into the training system, it kind of it diversifies that training system. So I personally think that's a good thing. But I think those kind of, there would be some concerns around the current regulations that the GMC sets upon training, essentially. And coming back to those tick boxes and making sure, have you ticked those tick boxes and have you done it appropriately to then eventually CCT? So there's always going to be like some kind of standard you have to meet in order to CCT. So going back to those competencies you've gained outside of training, I think what's important is that they can start to be accredited within the training systems. And so there is some work that the Academy is doing at the moment looking at this, and that we've been feeding into the BMA Junior Doctors Committee. So the most recent output from this group, and this came from the initial ACAS agreement in 2016 with the junior doctors dispute, and it was looking at how difficult it is to transfer competencies between specialties, so within the training system. And so a couple of months ago, we were part of this group that published this new framework that allowed you to transfer those competencies between specialties when you move specialties. The next step for that group is looking at how we can accredit competencies that are gained outside of the formal training system when you go into it. And so that, I think, if we manage to get to that, which is what I hope we are able to do, will help develop a bit more of that bottom-up grassroots approach to training, perhaps. The other thing I think that does need to be looked at and does need to be brought into training is the ability to step on and step off your formal training program, so that when you step on the beginning of that treadmill, you aren't just carried through it. And I know there's opportunities for out of program, but we need to liberalise that. And you shouldn't, in my opinion, have to give a reason if you want to step off of that training program to then sort of step back onto it again. I think that you should be able to do that because it's right for you at that point in your life. So that's my thoughts, but I'd be interested to hear the others.
Yeah, so we have a question from Twitter, actually. So we've kind of talked a lot about the stability of training, and it kind of bounced off of Sarah's question as well. So how do we have that accreditation? And with the word accreditation, it almost comes with, that's tick boxing, isn't it? You're probably going to be graded on it as somehow a standard that you have to meet to become accredited. So what if you are a nomadic person? If you do want to just locum for the rest of your life, you just want to, spend a week here, couple months there, have a new partner, new commitments. How do we achieve that for those people? Anyone want to pitch in?
Yeah, I mean, because I fundamentally think the calling it an FY3 year sets the wrong bar, in that, you know, we know that at the moment the foundation doctors are sometimes seen as slightly separate to the specialty. And I think, you know, once you're an FY3, you are no different from a skills-wise from a core trainee. So why can't you participate with the same opportunities that they have? And most specialties have now opened up their portfolios so that you do not have to be a formal trainee to use them. And actually you can then show and demonstrate in the same way that a formal trainee can, that you've achieved those competencies. And it's great to hear that we're hopefully moving on to a transferable competency, because I remember having those conversations, you know, 12, 15 years ago, and the real resistance and struggle we were having in saying that, you know, the surgical skills you learnt in obstetrics and gynecology were similar to what you were going to learn in a general surgical post. So actually we should be able to transfer and move those across. And I think that's kind of a fundamental thing that we need to have. And that will allow people to then have a slightly more flexible pathway through their training, to allow them to step in and step out with a combination of, you know, formal training jobs, standalone jobs, or locum jobs. And kind of slightly speaking with a program director's hat on, whilst, you know, it would be great to allow trainees to step in and step out, logistically, it does become a bit of a minefield and a nightmare. You know, I have a small rotation. I only have 19 trainees, but, you know, with the variety of things that people are stepping out for, you know, whether they're going out for research, whether they're going out to get extra experience for maternity leave, it makes it very difficult to know, you know, how many new trainees can we take on, because we've got people coming back in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. And actually we need to find a way of simplifying that and allowing that to become easier in order to get the support of people who are responsible for managing those training programs to, you know, support people having more flexibility to step in and step out of a kind of formal training pathway, which I think they do need. I think we've tried to squeeze it in too much now. And I think many people are kind of coming towards the end and not feeling ready to take that next step, and then looking for reasons to try and stay as a trainee, when actually, you know, we should be saying to people, you know, you stay as a trainee as long as you need to, in order to feel comfortable and competent to move on to the next step of your career.
What you say is really important. In the general population, we know that 40% of jobs are going to go with artificial intelligence. If you look at the history of medicine over the last 10 years, cardiothoracic surgeons virtually disappeared because of stenting. Radiologists now, I mean, there's very good evidence that actually artificially you can get a more accurate result on a lot of radiographs or whatever. Where's this going to stop? And I would say, so for example, we're now managing most of renal care in primary care in Tower Hamlets. Okay, how's that possible? Well, the answer is most of renal care is based on blood tests. Well, actually, that's very amenable to artificial intelligence. Actually, our artificial intelligence is the consultant who comes out virtually into the community, and when we ask for advice, writes it in our notes remotely. But think of the new world that's coming our way, and how much of the specialties will disappear or be done in a different way. And therefore, the vital importance of creating great flexibility. I think Charlie Massey at the GMC I think he calls this credentialing, if I've got it right. Actually, you get credentials for whatever you do, and then you can much more easily move into different specialties or different areas anywhere during your career. But I think unless we change something very rapidly, I think we're going to set up a lot of our specialists to be becoming redundant in the future.
Right. So I think in an attempt to bring everything together, I'm going to ask if everyone can kind of summarize a 2-minute, very quick, your key thoughts on obviously, I think we believe that something needs to change. In an ideal situation, where do you see training and kind of competence in, let's say, 5 years' time? If you had all the power in the world, where would you see training? So maybe if we start with Sarah.
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? So reflecting on some of the discussions we've had, I think one of the key themes that is coming through as well is prioritizing and having time for training. Because I was thinking about what Ron was saying about the fact that actually some of the assessments that can take place that can be part of that tick box can have value if they're done in the right way. And I was reflecting on some of my own experiences recently, and one of my consultants, they'd set up sort of Zoom clinics to get your CBD done, and they were some of the best CBDs I've ever done, because there was time allotted and I was able to properly explore this kind of aspect of training that I was going through. And I didn't feel like I was pestering somebody in order to get that training done. So I think one of the key points here, and one of the big problems we have in some areas of training at the moment, is that training is not prioritized and the trainers themselves are not given enough time, resources, and facilities that is needed to make sure that training is prioritized. So going back to the kind of like the initial question of tick boxes, yes, I do think that there is a need to reduce some of the tick boxes, and I think that will potentially help with burnout and some of the feeling of being on that constant treadmill. But I think the future is in prioritizing training, is learning from things like what Sam was talking about in terms of giving people that individualized approach to their training, access to academics, access to leadership opportunities, be able to diversify in terms of what they are doing. And basically freeing training from the current very rigid structure. So you get this kind of halfway house system between how it used to be and how it currently is, so that individuals are able to map their own training to their own personal needs, so that people are able to be doctors but also live their lives alongside that as well. And I think that's what many trainees are looking for going forwards from their training programs, because there'll be some trainees for whom it suits them to want to travel around kind of certain centres, and for some trainees they will want to stay in this one area. And it's around how do you ensure that individualised approach can be retained and looked at going forwards.
And Ram, where do you see the perfect 5-year training?
So for me, I think there is a need to have much more with each specialty looking at driving how it's going to train. I think it's a bit too top down. It comes from HEE or the GMC. You know, they're too controlling over what each specialty can do. And that means you have areas that may be too large for some specialties or too small for other specialties. So I would like to see a bit more local opportunity for people to innovate and deliver training. That selection is not done on a tick box, but we are potentially actually doing it like, you know, private companies, you know, doing it over a longer period, because, you know, in some ways you're selecting somebody that's potentially going to be a trainee in that region for 8 or more years, and actually basing it on an application form and a half-an-hour interview, I think is completely insufficient. So we need to be looking at that and allow local areas to have some flexibility and control on how they want to deliver it and how they want to incentivize trainees to come there, trainees to stay there, and trainees to work there. And I think we do need to, and I think we're seeing it already, is move the pendulum the other way. So, you know, kind of get away from the very rigid assessment structure and have it that we're making sure that we're training and giving colleagues the skills that they need to work in a modern health service, but that we are allowing them to develop at their own speed and their own pace, with assessments that they're going to find helpful and useful for their training and their future career.
And Sam, I will leave you with the final word, or rather penultimate word, because Johan will quickly finish us off.
So I think it's about bringing the joy back into medicine. It's as simple as that. So how do we do that in Tower Hamlets? So as a CCG chair, I invest something like 600,000 a year on our quality improvement team that goes in to every practice and helps them work out what they want to do what matters to them in terms of quality improvement. And as a result, the joy in our workplaces in primary care in Tower Hamlets is 22% above the national average for a workplace. And just to give you an illustration of how I know that too, is that we have primary care summits, not during COVID, but where we get all our GPs together. And the last time we did it in a local cinema, and we were grossly oversubscribed. We had a waiting list for GPs to come. We had GPs gate crashing the event. And there was two lovely moments out of many that I want to describe. Firstly was a 20-year-old receptionist who'd done an amazing project, actually, that had really had a positive impact on the practice. And then there was one of our local GPs who trans from male to female. And you can imagine ours is quite a big religious Muslim community, and stood up in front of the whole of this audience and told the story of what that was like and how she felt so supported. And it was moments like that where you hear the silence in the room and the emotion and the pride of being part of something like this. So I just bring it back to something very simple: bring back the joy. You know, as a trainer myself over the years, and part of the training system within our practice with these new doctors, I just want them to enjoy themselves and be happy. And I reckon actually that is almost, I'm nearly almost home actually, in terms of actually ensuring there'll be good, enthusiastic, non-burnt out GPs. And I don't think we focus nearly enough on that. And you talked about the tick box, and I think that's destructive of autonomy and joy. And I think, to me, it's everything you describe is utterly tragic. When I've seen so many people in Tower Hamlets, and when I've had such fun in my career and seen it's such a privilege to be as a GP, you know, there's hardly a day I don't go in with a spring in my step. And that's all to do with my team and the people who work around me, and the ethos and the fun and remembering people's birthdays. It's these things actually you need to help people with. Not can they, you know, do this particular procedure perfectly in general practice. Let's just bring back the fundamentals.
Well, thank you so much. At the very least, I've had incredible joy hosting you all, and it's been a riveting discussion. So I'll leave the final word with Johan. That's okay.
Thank you to the whole panel for joining us and discussing this vital topic. Tonight has been absolutely fascinating. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing health systems, we challenge them to think about how, as a leader, to navigate that flexibility and how to frame their decision making. Tonight's discussion is one of the many challenges facing all our health systems, workforce, and the challenges faced by it. If you're interested in exploring a lot of the challenges that face health systems and want to think how you can lead those systems as a clinician, do get in touch with the HLA and do get involved. HLA Live is thanks to a wider team as well as the people that you've seen on tonight. So Eamon, Riddy, Alistair, Adil, Tim and Pedro for their incredible hard work delivering the programme. We are incredibly lucky to have scholars that want to make a significant impact on health systems across the globe and use the HLA as a platform to bring their incredible ideas and innovations to fruition. If you're interested in the work of the HLA, do make sure you catch a future HLA Live episode. Join us at a HLA event, apply for one of our programs, or apply to become a scholar. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Johan Marlwana, and it is good night from all of us.